Welcome everybody. I'm not going to take up a lot of your time with a long introduction because we want to get to the good stuff. So welcome to the Westminster Law Review workshop. It's specifically about academic articles. So first of all, we're going to have a presentation by Professor Lisa Webley, who's going to explain how to write an academic article. And then Pravin Jairaj, who is our academic editor at the Law Review and who has published an article in the Law Review, is going to give us his expertise on how to rework your coursework and what editors are looking for when you write an academic article. I think Professor Webley is happy to take questions as she goes along, and then she'll just repeat them. But if you have any questions along the way, then by all means feel free to ask. We're here to try and provide a service to you and to try and get you a little bit more confident about writing these kind of academic articles and submitting to journals like the Westminster Law Review. So without any further ado, Professor Webley.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for turning out on a snowy day to be here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the things it's worth you thinking about when it comes to writing for law reviews. Firstly, to work out whether you really want to, because you may not. Secondly, to think about what you should consider when you're looking at a piece of work you've already got. So in many instances, people have got something they've already written that they want to rework for publication. So have a bit of a think about that, because your best platform for publication may not be a law review, it might be something else. And then if you decide it is a law review, what you need to bear in mind and how you need to think about the drafting process to get the best you can out of your academic work. So those are the things I'm going to take you through. If you've got questions as we go along and you do want to ask them, please do feel free. Your voices may not be picked up very effectively on the mic, so I might need to repeat the question. Don't be alarmed if I do that. Okay, so the first thing I think is probably useful is a definition of a law review. So what's a law review? What's it there for? They are academic journals. So a law review is an academic journal similar to the sorts of journals that academics will publish in. And in fact, some academics have published in the short sections at the end of the Westminster Law Review. So it's an academic journal. It's not a practitioner journal. It's not a journal that's like a newsletter. It's very heavily academically focused. It's peer-reviewed, meaning that your work's going to be reviewed for quality before a decision is taken as to whether or not you are going to be able to publish in this publication. So it's not a, I've written something, would you like to publish it? It's you saying, I've written something, will you consider this for publication? Would you mind looking at it? And so it means that there's a team, there's an advisory board and an academic editorial team, some of whom are here, who will look through your work, and it will be looked at certainly by one, maybe two people, and they're going to spend quite a lot of time critiquing it to decide whether or not it's eligible to go any further. Law reviews demand high standards. That's why it's prestigious to publish in a law review as opposed to a number of other kinds of reviews. And so your work needs to be in-depth, evidence-based and original, and that's important. That means you've got to come up with something new. Now, you don't necessarily need to come up with a whole new theory of law, but you've got to come to some conclusions throughout your article, which others may not previously have come to themselves. This is not about you saying, this is what I have learnt. This is about what I can tell you that you may not already know. So it really is quite a high standard. And obviously, on that basis, your arguments need to be in-depth, evidenced, quality evidence, not I found something I can pop in a footnote. It's what else is there out there? What else is there out there which you can then use? And your arguments obviously need to be fully referenced. Okay, So that's what a law review is. There are lots of law reviews in the US, and the law review system in the US and in Canada, on the whole, is publishing academics work. This is a law review that's publishing student and academic work, assuming it's of the right quality. So the Westminster Law Review will publish student work if eligible. Okay, so what they're not. It's important not to confuse a law review with a newspaper or magazine. It's very different feel, very different writing style, very different perception of depth. It's not a practitioner journal, so in a law review you are not writing for lawyers. That doesn't mean that lawyers wouldn't find it interesting or useful, but your principal audience is academic. It is not a place for you to publish your coursework in the form that you produced it for your assessment. So if you did an excellent dissertation and you got a mark of 75, that's fabulous, but you're not going to be able to say, here's my dissertation, please consider it for publication. You're going to need to do some more work on it. It's going to need reworking and refocusing. It's not somewhere to publish what you've learnt. It's something for you to publish what you can help others to learn. So the purpose of an article in a law review is to bring a new perspective, or to draw a new conclusion, or to make people think a little differently about their academic discipline. It's not to say, look at what I've learned, I'm going to show that off. That's not what it's there to do, and that's not what academic journals are there to do. It's not about your journey, it's about what you've worked out that you can help other people to learn about. So it has to go beyond you simply showing what you've learned. Okay. So, now I've been through what a law review is, I think it's worth thinking about, do you really want to publish in a law review, or do you want to publish somewhere else? Perfectly acceptable to have your work published somewhere else. It's great to get it published anywhere. And it may be that what you want to say would appeal to a different audience. It may be better to publish it somewhere else. So let's have a look at some of the things you might want to think about. So, worth considering, what question do you want to answer? The best articles usually come from a research question. So it's about posing a question to yourself, which you can then research, so that you can then learn and from there formulate arguments which you can then justify, which you can then effectively teach back to somebody else. Some people may know some of them, but hopefully the people who are reading it won't know all of them already. So it's about provoking academic debate and thought. So what question do you want to answer? Because that might make a difference to where you publish. How will you go about answering that question? What's your mode? What's the point? Are you going to interview a few people? Is it a think piece? Is this a piece of library-based research? Are you focusing on doctrine, on black letter law, cases and statutes? Are you looking at theories, or one particular theory and analysing everything through that? Or something else? Are you wanting to do a quick survey? Because that's going to change not just what you write, but where you should seek publication. Who's going to be interested? Now, I know for many of us, we want to get published because we want to get published. But in terms of the law review, they want to publish something that's going to interest their readership. Their purpose is to interest other people, not to get you published. So, who will be interested in your answer? And what will they already know? Because that might change the nature of the question you wish to pose. Might change that, and it might change how you go about undertaking your research, and it might change where you decide to publish it. So what question, how do you want to go about answering it, who is going to be interested, what do they already know, and why is this of interest to you? And how are you going to convince others that it's of interest to them? Now, we make decisions all the time, every single day, most hours, as to what we read and what we don't. Quick scan on the internet, look at the first bit that's written under a link. Nah, not bothering with that. Look at something, oh yeah, no, I'm going to look at that. You open a textbook, look at the start of a chapter and think, not bothering with that. You might look at an article and decide to read it. We all make decisions all the time. So who's going to read your article, and what spin, what side, what sort of perspective can you put on it that's going to be interesting to people to read? Because the Law Review wants to publish things that will interest people. So what is it about your article that's going to be able to grab people at the beginning and make them think, oh yeah, that's a good idea? Is it the title? A catchy title? And then will the article live up to the promise of the title? Is it the introduction? What is it about this topic and this question that interests you? Because if it doesn't interest you, you're going to struggle to make it of interest to anybody else. And then I think the more fundamental questions, which we don't tend to talk about, but which I think are really important, particularly for those of you who are currently studying and researching. How much time do you want to spend on this? And what is your purpose in writing something for publication? Is this a CV filler? Good idea, but is that the purpose? Or are you hoping to move in this direction in terms of a career? Or is this something you feel passionate about, which has a political stance or an advocacy purpose? What is it? So I think these are all the things you need to work through and think about before you decide to make a commitment to anything publication-wise. Okay? Right, so when we think about the who then, who's your primary audience? Are you aiming your article at students? If so, undergrad, postgrad, PhD? Are you aiming it at academics and PhD students? Are you aiming it at lawyers in practice? Are you aiming it at people who know nothing about law? Because you'll write that very differently if you're writing something for people who aren't lawyers at all. Is it to try and inform people? Are you writing for a domestic audience or an international audience? So something like the Westminster Law Review will be picked up by people from other jurisdictions, but its focus is, whilst international in scope in some respects, I don't think you need to write consistently thinking people know nothing whatsoever about the British system. But some journals, that might be the case. You might need to have to start with a very basic explanation of the system before you can move on to your research findings. You might need to spend just a little bit of time doing some research on your intended audience, because that's going to make a real difference to how you frame your article. So if I'm writing an article for a European audience, many of whom will come from civil law rather than common law jurisdictions, I approach it quite differently from if I'm writing an article which I think will be picked up by people in the UK, common law Canada, Australia, the US. Because I don't need to explain certain things. I know we have a shared frame of reference, but if I'm going elsewhere, might need to actually draw some illustrations of similarity and difference between the British system and other systems that I think will have readers associated with them. Okay, what? This is really the difficult one, I think. What do you want your audience to know at the end of your article? Now, it's quite difficult to be able to do this at the beginning, but if you're somebody who's already got something written and you want to try and rework it for publication, many of you will be in that situation, what do you want them to know at the end? There's a purpose to writing an article. It is to communicate, and it's to communicate what you've worked out that you think others may not have worked out yet. In my experience, and I review articles for a number of journals, a number of international journals, so I get sent draft articles from academics and I go through them. My experience is most articles can probably only get, even an 8,000 to 10,000 word article can probably only communicate 3 to 5 main arguments. Really? That's not to say there aren't other things underneath, but you've got 3 to 5 what we call takeaways at the end. And that's going to an extent, shape the structure of your article. What is it that this audience, that is the readership of this journal, whichever journal it is that you're focusing on, is going to be most interested in? There's no point trying to convince an academic audience of some very practitioner-focused material. Publish in a practitioner journal. Equally, if your conclusion in the end is, well, I found a few things out, isn't that interesting? You're going to struggle to be able to rework that in a way that's going to appeal to a journal. So what do you want your audience to know and take away from your article? And if you can work that through, if you've already got a piece of work that you are reworking, it really will help you to focus your article around those key messages. Okay. Now the why question is about purpose, really. Writing with a purpose. It's much easier to communicate effectively if you know what the purpose of your article is, and the purpose of your article has to go beyond, I'm writing this because I want to get published. I mean, yes, we've all got that going on, but there's got to be something more than that. So what is the purpose of this article? It's a self-contained unit. So what are you hoping to achieve with it? Is this about policy change? Is this about trying to highlight a theorist that you think is very neglected, that you want to explain how their theories will help? Is it about demonstrating some empirical statistical evidence that you have come across and how that changes the nature of the debate? Is it about advocating a law change? There's some purpose behind it. Now, I think this is quite difficult for many people to work out. What I often do with PhD students, and I have done with some academics as well, is to say, look, okay, let's step away from this a minute. Tell me about your research question. Tell me what either fires you up about it. There's some reason you're doing this, I hope. So what fires you up? What makes you passionate about it? Or, and this is more usual, what's the problem with this area that you think you've got the solution to? Because most of us come up with research questions linked to problems which we perceive, which we then think we've got an answer to. We don't like to be honest about that because we want to say, I'm being very neutral. I don't know the answer. You think, yes, you do. You may not be right, but yes, you do. Just be honest about it. Use it as a hypothesis. That's fine. But just be clear. If you think there's a problem, you probably think there's a solution, even if it's just a tentative answer. So if you can tell me that, we can work out why. And it might be you think the law's wrong. You think something's unfair. You think this legal framework's not working. You think this group have been neglected. You think policy is completely skewed the wrong way. There's something going on for you. So if you can work that out, you can really give an edge to your article because this probably helps with your originality. If you can work out the why, you can probably work out how you can add an original twist to it. And then the how, I've already mentioned. How do you want to communicate your research findings? Is a journal article the best idea? If so, great. Or do you want to aim this at practicing lawyers? Do you want to put it on a blog? Do you want it to go in a newspaper, in the law set? What do you hope to achieve? And this flows on from the why. Once you've worked out the purpose, it's much easier to work out the vehicle to achieve that. And of course you can do multiple things. There's no reason why you can't take a piece of research and publish the academic stuff in a journal article, put the edited highlights on the blog and cross-refer to the article, try and put the more policy-orientated pieces in a piece for a newspaper or a magazine or an industry publication, write up a short piece for a practitioner journal. You can do all of those things. You can take one thing, spread it all over. But you need to write very different pieces for those things. Okay. So, anyone got any questions so far, or are we all just about okay? Right, so assuming I've not put you off completely writing a journal article, I think the next thing to do is to think a bit about what they look like on the whole. Now, these are just my impressions based on me both writing articles and reviewing them, but they seem to hold up on the whole. In terms of sort of Anglo, North American, Australian practice, not true of all law journals. Most academic journals are looking for around about 8,000 words, and I think the Westminster Law Review is usually looking 6,000 to 8,000, but there's a bit of wiggle room depending on the quality of the article. So I'm going to take 8,000 just because that's probably around what you're looking at for most journals. Now, the introduction for an article of that length is about 500 to 800 words usually. So we're not talking a paragraph. This is closer to looking like a dissertation in some respects, an undergraduate length dissertation. So we're talking probably 500 to 800 words. We'll have a look in a minute at what roughly it probably contains. Then the article is probably split into about 3 to 5 sections. That's not true of all, but that's probably the average. And if you work that through, that means most of the sections are going to be somewhere around 1,200 to 2,500 words. And they're self-contained units. Okay? They're like mini essays. They deal with an issue all the way through to conclusion, and then you move on to the next section. They are often separated by subheadings, not always, but they often are. So they're clearly defined. And if you think of my 3 to 5 takeaways, the idea that you can probably communicate 3 to 5 clear arguments, you probably find each one will have a separate section, which you work all the way through to conclusion. And then, of course, there'll be a conclusion at the end, and they vary between 500 to 1,000 words on average. And this conclusion is going to take the conclusion from section 1, section 2, section 3, 4, whatever, and it's going to basically truncate those conclusions and then add on a new conclusion. So each of those individual sections is going to come to a conclusion. And then from there, all of those conclusions will build up to an overall conclusion. Okay? Now, in terms of the Westminster Law Review, as I've said, we're usually looking at articles of about 6,000 to 8,000 words. There's some flexibility, I believe.
Yeah, it's up to 10.
Up to 10. Wow. Go for your life. But nonetheless, you've got a bit that you can work with there. I wouldn't aim at the 10, because what I would say is you're going to need more analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute, than you expect or you think you're capable of. You'll get there. And so I think aiming at the 5 and then going up is probably somewhat better than anything else. I think if you aim for 10 and then have to try and cut it down and then augment it, you may find it a bit of a struggle. Okay. Would anybody like to ask me anything about this? No? Are we all right with this? Okay. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. What does an introduction look like? And this holds good for other academic written work as well, but obviously, depending on the length, it may need narrowing down a bit. So what will the introduction likely contain? Well, in some instances, it will contain a basic discussion of the previous academic research on the area, and I'll explain that in a minute. As well as an introduction of what you will be discussing yourself in your article. Or it could simply set out the background to the study, and then provide the anatomy, the signpost, to the rest of the article. Okay, so there's quite a lot in here. What it should do is set out your purpose. This is the point of this article, this is what I'm trying to convey, and act as a signpost ready to what's going to come next. So if we go right back to the beginning, when I started speaking, I said I'm going to deal with this, and I'm going to deal with this, and I'm going to deal with this, and I'm going to deal with this. Very briefly. And then I moved on, and I've worked my way through those sections. It's exactly the same with an introduction. People overcomplicate introductions, which I understand. I've done it myself. Often they think, I've got to put everything in the introduction. I've got to put the background, the history, the development, everything. And then what am I going to write about in the main body? Because I think I've got everything in there, and now I'm having to write it all over again. And I think the strongest introductions are ones which basically say, this is what I'm trying to achieve with this. And you can give some background as to what the nature of the problem is. That's no problem if it's a problem. What you think the issue is that needs to be resolved. And this is how I'm going to achieve it. I'm going to deal with this in section 1, and this in section 2, and this in section 3, and this is in section 4. It's I'm setting this up just so that you're clear. Now, some people and some articles will provide the conclusion as well in the introduction, and that can work very well. This is where I'm going to get us to at the end. So this is the study, this is what we're going to look at here, and this is what I concluded, and now I'm going to show you how I got there. That's a different way of doing it, but it's perfectly acceptable. What you don't want to do is to give away absolutely your fabulous ta-da moment at the end. You want to leave that for the end. But you can give a bit of a teaser at the beginning. It's a bit like the trailer, you know, the film trailer. That's what introductions are. You want to give enough flashing images and excitement that people get to the end and think it's worth carrying on. As opposed to, do you know what? There's something that might be on television I'd rather be watching than reading this article. And often academics are very bad at very, very poor at writing their introductions, so they grab your attention. But that's what you really could do with doing. It's a signpost, it's an attention grabber, and you've got to get the purpose in there, and if you want to, you might want to give a bit of a teaser about where you're going to take people in terms of conclusion. You're going to need to redraft your introduction anyway, even if you choose to try and write it at the beginning. I don't. I, on the whole, don't write my introductions until I've actually got the main body of my essay done. But if I am trying to redraft, if I do a draft to begin with to try and set up what I'm trying to do, I always have to go back and redraft it. Because once you know where you got to at the end, you need to then come back to the beginning and redraft it so it looks as if you knew at the beginning what you knew at the end. And it's the key to good writing. You start off in a world of confusion. I mean, we say you don't, but we do, usually. Even if we think we know the answer, we're a bit fuzzy without realising it. You get to the end, and hopefully by the end of the piece of writing, you think, oh yeah, I have worked this out. I have got some new stuff here. But then the worst thing you can do is stop there and hand it back. What you need to do, once you've got to the end, is think, now I know the answer, I need to go back to the beginning and set up that answer all the way through. So it's as if I shot the film knowing how it ended, because then I can put the twists in. Then I can throw people off the scent, or then I can show them something fabulous. Make sure we had this scene happen so that this made sense at the end. But if you shoot it moving forwards and then at the end you go, well, there you go, that was fun, and you leave it, people all the way through are going, well, I can't see where she's going. Is she? Oh, no. Perhaps she? Oh, no. And for many of us, including me, with some of the stuff that I've written, you'll find people writing at the end of paragraphs, and so? And they're thinking, no. We're now moving off somewhere else. Not quite sure why, but we're moving off somewhere else. And of course, all those loose threads are still blinking away in the back of our brains as we work our way around. So your introduction is going to need a redraft once you know where you got to at the end. And in most instances, for me, this is the last bit I finish. I will redraft regularly, get to the end, put my final redraft on the conclusion, and then I will go back and redraft my introduction. I might play around a bit with my title as well, I suppose. Okay. Anybody want to ask me anything about introductions? Are we all okay? No. Okay, so the middle body then, the main body. So you've got a series of sections, usually. And what those are will depend a lot on what question you've asked yourself. And as I've said, I think that the best written work, best journal articles, come from a research question, a question you've posed yourself. You can draw it how you wish to. And then each individual section poses a sub-question. So the difficulty with writing, if you've just got a title, which isn't a question, and doing research to answer that, is it operates like what I refer to in some of my writing work as an inverted funnel. So if you've got a statement, which basically says, women solicitors are now treated as equals with male solicitors, statement. And you're first of all doing, for example, your library-based research. So you're starting off by looking at the academic literature first, what academics have found in their studies first. Then you might go on and look at some statistics for the profession and other things. And you've got a statement. The tendency is when you do your keyword searching, which you will probably do through something like Google Scholar, you do your keyword search and your search broadens out. A bit like an inverted funnel. So you start here and then you end up with it doing this. Because everything you look at, you think, oh, well, that's about women's solicitors, I better look at that. That's about male solicitors, I better look at that. And it keeps going out and out and out and out. Really difficult to make notes because you start writing down all sorts. I'll write about these women, this, and these men, this, and solicitors, this, and equality, this. And it just gets worse and worse. If you pose yourself a question, to what extent are women solicitors now treated as equals with male solicitors, it actually works the other way. It operates like a proper funnel. It goes like this. Because you'll read it and you think, so how does that help me with this question? It doesn't. Forget it then. I'm not making notes on that. How does this help me? This bit helps me. This bit here helps me. I'll note that down. Because I can now say, and therefore, this suggests that, blah. So it's just a slight trick. It's just a cognitive trick, but your brain works slightly differently if it's looking at a question versus if it's looking at a statement. And it just makes your life a little easier. It's not that it's better or worse research, but it's actually about efficiency as much as anything. So in terms of the main body, what you need to do is try and come up with some sub-questions. So which sub-questions necessarily flow from the main question? The main question here will require you to say, well, I need to work this out first, and then I need to work out this, and then this, and then this. Form a sub-question out of each of those things. And if you've got loads of sub-questions, you look at it and you think, I've got 12 sub-questions. Then your main question is way too broad. You need to start focusing it down. You can probably only manage 3 to 5. So, needs to come down. Need to narrow your focus for this article. So in terms of the middle sections, they're mini essays. They need an introduction, middle sections, conclusion. Self-contained. Really quite easy. Once you've got it broken down, same in coursework, it's exactly the same. Same with a PhD thesis. They're all self-contained. Each chapter is self-contained. Each section is self-contained. As long as you can be clear on what you're trying to do. And it's the same with paragraphs. Exactly the same with a paragraph. A paragraph is a self-contained unit. And in that paragraph, you need to make a point, justify a point, explain its relevance or importance in relation to the sub-question or the argument you are advancing. That's all we're doing. What have I found? How do I know I'm right? That's where you justify your argument, develop it, and show your evidence base through your footnotes. And what does this mean? What do I think this means in relation to the question? So your point is, what have I found out? Not, what did this judge say in the case? That's not a point, that's evidence. That's evidence for something you have yet to work through as a point. A point is not, I'm marking a lot of public law coursework at the minute, so I've got public law in my head. A point is not, Dicey said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's Dicey's point, yes? It's not yours, not your point. So what have you worked out? Now the difficulty is that you probably don't know what you've worked out until you've worked it out. So when you start writing, you don't know what you know because you don't yet know it. And this is the difficulty with the writing process, because the writing process is circular. It's just that most of us get off the circle a little too early because it's hard work and we're getting a bit dizzy. So we start, the way our brains work is we have to describe what we've read, usually. So you do your research, you find a source, I don't know, you get a book, you think the book's useful, it appears to help you with your sub-question. So what do we normally do? We usually describe what that person has said, the bits of that person's research that we think is relevant. That's description. That's stage one. From there, what we do, if we're prepared to keep going around the circle, is to say, okay, so what does this mean? What do I think this means? What have I worked out in relation to my sub-question? That's stage two. That's the start of analysis. That's the start of analysis. So what we've got is a block of text, a bit like a paragraph, me describing what Dicey said. And then at the end, a sentence maybe of me saying this is what I think this means. And that's what I've got. And many of us at that point go, hurrah, analysis, I'm going to stop. But if you're willing to take on the challenge, the trick is take that last sentence, or two sentences, of your early analysis, your conclusion, move it from the bottom to the top of your paragraph. Because now you've got this is what I've worked out at the beginning of your paragraph. That's a lot stronger. That's higher level. So you've already started communicating with your audience. This is what I've worked out. Now you've still got that chunk of description in the middle where you described what Dicey said, and then you at the bottom you said this is what I think it means. You put that bit at the top. You've still got what Dicey said. So now what you want to do is you want to redraft that. And you redraft that to show how what Dicey said got you to this conclusion at the top. You've taken a source, you've read it, you've filtered it through your brain, you've come to a conclusion, the conclusion's gone to the top, and then what you've done is you've reworked that description to become the justification for how you know your conclusion is right. Now, if you can do that, your paragraph has just gone from, in undergraduate terms, this is my description and this is my sentence, high 50s. You've got that round to the top, might have now hit 60 something, maybe. You're redrafting, you're moving in the direction of a first, and then what you do at the end of the paragraph is you come up with an even better conclusion. Because now you read back through that paragraph, and now you're clear, this is what I've worked out, and this is why I think I'm right with my evidence base. Your brain, which is constantly doing a little dance of what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? And so our brains are doing all the time. You're doing it now. What's she on about? All the time. What does it mean for me? Oh, that's what I did in my essay. Oh, that's what I did in my disc. Oh, that chapter needs reworking. Whatever it is that's going on in your head is constantly going in the background. So when you reread that paragraph, you'll find you come to an even better conclusion. Look back at your sub-question again. Now what do you think it means? It'll be even higher. It's a higher level of analysis. Now, if you're up for it and you're not too dizzy going around this circle, because you've got right back to the beginning of the circle now, and you can cope with it, you take the new conclusion. You move it to the top of the paragraph. Now you've got a better conclusion. You redraft the middle of the paragraph, because now you can make an even better justification for how you know you're right. And then you come up with an even higher level conclusion by looking back at the question. And you've just jumped into the 80s with luck. You've just got your PhD thesis published with luck. Whatever it is, you've just gone round and round. So what you do, if you're prepared to go with the redrafting, is you harness the power of your brain. What your brain does all the time is try to make meaning. Brains are meaning-making machines. That's why we're still here. So, constantly trying to make meaning. The difficulty is if you don't do any redrafting, so you leave it as, this is what I read, and this is what I think it means, the person who's reading your work is doing the, what does it mean, what does it mean, what does it mean, what does it mean, all the way through your paragraph. And then when we get to the end, and you've said, I think it means this, and their brain's been doing this all the way through, and they think, really? How did you get there? I think it means that. They're now having an argument with your paragraph. And they think your argument, which is implied, it's not explicit, is actually not that strong because they've come to a different conclusion. And it's something that advocates learn when you do advocacy training. One of the things they always teach you is plant the seed in the mind of the judge or the jury or the client right at the beginning. This is what you need to know. This is how I know I'm right. This is why it's important. You wouldn't, if you were addressing a jury in a criminal trial and you were defending somebody for murder, describe the evidence to the jury and do a long description of the evidence. And then at the end say, oh, by the way, this means he didn't do it. You wouldn't do that. You'd start by saying, it is clear my client didn't do this because the forensic evidence proves somebody else handled the murder weapon and not my client. Bang. That's what you would give the jury. The next thing you would then do is to describe the evidence and how you've reached that conclusion. But you wouldn't say, here's the knife. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the knife. The knife, this is the murder weapon. It's this long. It's got a black handle. It's got fingerprints on it. It's got 2 sets of fingerprints on it. None of the fingerprints are smudged. Suggests nobody was wearing gloves. 1 set of fingerprints belonged to the person who was sadly murdered. The other set of fingerprints, belonged to somebody other than my client. Therefore, my client didn't do it. You'd never do that. You'd always start with the, this is what you need to know, and then you justify it. And it's exactly the same with any written communication. If you want to give your best possible persuasive argument, start with what you've worked out, but you have to work it out first through writing and then redraft it. So each of your middle sections will operate like that, and each of the paragraphs will probably operate like that. It's not the only way to write. There are many other ways to do it, but if you're trying to be persuasive, that does seem to be effective. If you've got a better way of doing it, please go with your way. But in the absence of anything that gets you to the level of analysis you want, you might want to try this to begin with and see whether it gets you to where you want to be. So you've got your introduction, series of middle sections, all split up with their own introductions, middle, paragraphs and a conclusion. And then you've got your final conclusion. Now this should be easy. Conclusion should be easy. If you've reached conclusions at the end of each of your subsections, and your conclusions at the end of each of your subsections should be easy if you've reached a conclusion at the end of each paragraph. Because you should be able to take, for each subsection, each of the last sentence or few sentences of each paragraph and put them together into one conclusion paragraph at the end of your subsection, which you can redraft, obviously. It shouldn't just be a collection of this is this last sentence, this is this last sentence, this is this last sentence, but put it there, read through it, work out what it means, redraft it, go around the same cycle as before. And then your final conclusion should be, if I take the conclusion from subsection 1, and I take the conclusion from section 2, and I take the one from 3, and I put them, just cut and paste them all. And then I read through all of those and redraft them, going round in a loop. I should then have my brain doing the, and therefore what does it, I have a new higher level conclusion. And I can then now add that as another paragraph. So I've taken maybe 3 to 5 paragraphs and maybe pulled them down into maybe 1, possibly 2. Then I've got a new, even higher level one, and I've put that down. And then, now I know what I've worked out, I can go right back to the beginning and redraft through. And then I should have a cracking article. Fingers crossed. Or dissertation. Or PhD thesis. Just take a bit longer if it's PhD thesis, because you'll be writing for the rest of your life. Okay, so I think what I want you to take away from this part really is to say that the writing process is easier if you think about it as a process rather than now I think I should have an answer, I'm going to write it up. It's iterative. I think you need to be able to distinguish between your evidence base and your analysis, and it's quite easy to do if you follow my suggestion. Evidence is anything that you've read or observed or heard. That's evidence. Unless it's actually something you worked out yourself, personally, it's not your analysis. Now, your evidence base will contain a lot of other people's analysis, but you're using it to justify what you've worked out. You use it first to lead you to understanding. Once you've understood, you can then look back at the question or the sub-question and work out what it means in the context of the question. So it's you applying it to a new situation. That should then lead you to your own analysis, and then that source material becomes your evidence to justify how you got to your conclusions, your analysis. So all analysis is a fancy way of saying the bit you added yourself, the bit you worked out for yourself, your own scholarly opinion. But it should be a scholarly opinion, and it should be an evidenced scholarly opinion. That's all it is. That's all we're doing. And most of us have got to write to get to a point where we have our analysis. Okay, so I think I've probably demonstrated, at least from my point of view, I think redrafting is the key. I think it's about seeing your writing as a means to work out your analysis. And then once you have worked out your analysis, you need to redraft in order to justify how you got to where you are. So when we talk about arguments, all we mean is your justification of your analysis. That's all an argument is. It's you justifying your analysis. This is what I've worked out, followed by this is my argument to demonstrate how I think I know I'm right, with reference to all the sources I've used and how they help me to justify. So you're going to need to redraft once you've worked out what you understand. And you may need to redraft again. So this may not be, I'll do it once, and then I'll redraft it, and then it's finished. In terms of my articles, or book chapters, I suppose, academic book chapters rather than textbook chapters, I'd say that if I've got off with 5 redrafts, I've been lucky, and it's probably closer to 10 or 15. Now, the first one takes forever, but when we talk about drafts later on, some of it's just tweaking. You know, your first draft is the hardest to write. Your second draft makes your brain hurt, because you're trying to do I'm taking what I've worked out and I've putting it at the top and I've redrafting. That makes this bit hurt. It actually just hurts here. It is actually the part of your brain that's working, apparently. It's very sugar intensive, so you know, you're allowed to eat chocolate at this stage. It really does get you here. Your third draft's much easier. This is not as painful, assuming that you've actually gone through that process, because at that point, you know where you've got to. And all you're doing is just slightly upping your game. And then after that, it's actually just about thinking, hang on a minute, this doesn't entirely flow through here, and I've not made explicit my link between this subsection and this subsection, and now I think about it, I've assumed they'll know about this, maybe they won't, maybe I need to add in a couple of sentences in the introduction. So your later drafts, on the whole, are much less problematic. I think the great thing about redrafting is you do up your analysis. You also are likely to write out of your article anything which you have inadvertently poorly paraphrased, because the more you keep redrafting and rewriting your sentences, the less likely it is that if you have mistakenly taken part of a sentence from somebody else, you think you've properly paraphrased it and you haven't properly paraphrased it. So you still have the footnote, but it's probably close to a quote. If you keep redrafting, the chances are you'll write that out. I don't suggest you use that as a mechanism to do so. Obviously, you need to take your notes properly in the first place, but it does make it less likely that you're going to end up with bits of sentences from somewhere else. You'll also find you're quite clever. Because the more you start redrafting, the more the light bulb goes on. I still think, actually, I might be getting somewhere here. It becomes much more fun at that stage. It's not very fun. Draft 1, no fun. Draft 2, absolutely no fun. Draft 3, I might have something here. This might be working. Later drafts start feeling quite clever. So you might want to give it a go. So you miss out on the feelings of clever if you stop at draft 2. You just got brain ache here and that's it. So it's essential the whole thing's redrafted. Okay. So, assuming that you've got to that stage, you've not given up, and I hope you won't. Assuming you've got to that stage, what about the law review process then? Well, even if you're not clear on the exact law review or law journal you're going to aim at when you're doing your early drafts, by the time you're getting to your later drafts, you really need to be redrafting with a particular journal in mind. You need to know what the journal requires, and I think Shamima's given out some of the guidelines. No, if not, they're on the website. You need to know what your footnotes are. I can't tell you how irritating and time-consuming it is. If you've done your references one way, thinking you're going to be submitting to one journal, and then you find yourself submitting to another one, and they say, oh no, we don't do Oscola, Oxford footnotes. We do Harvard in-text references. And you think, that's an afternoon of my life I'm never going to get back, if you're lucky. You need to be clear on what you're being asked to do. And it does actually change the writing style as well, so you want to be clear on that. You need to know a bit about word length. Is that inclusive or exclusive of footnotes? Thinking it's inclusive of footnotes and then realising your article's coming in too short, or worse still, the other way around and it's way too long. Can be a problem. Please do comply with all the style guidelines. The law review editors are not there as editors, as in journalistic editors. They're not going to change any of this stuff. They don't have the time. They don't have the inclination. And, you know, in the end you're going to have to do it. So you may as well get it right before you send it in. Do not submit anything that you do not consider to be completed and polished. As a journal reviewer for academic journals, it's rare I get a really an article which is not really properly finished. But I do get really grumpy when I do. Because I think, hang on a minute, you know, it's not as if we're paid to do this. You know, all of your academic editors are doing this for love, the love of academe. They don't get time for it. I don't get time for it. I don't get money for it. I do it because we all need to share the responsibility to do this kind of thing. Otherwise, nothing ever gets published of the right quality. But it doesn't half irritate me when somebody sends something to me and I think, you couldn't even proofread it. And I'm much more inclined to say something fairly acerbic in my comments if I've looked at it and I've thought, really? Really? What are you doing? You want this published? Proofread it. But also, you know, things in brackets highlighted in yellow, to be completed. Yes, that was the idea before you sent it to the editor. So obviously, never submit anything other than a completed, polished draft. I have known other reviewers just simply send it back with a really, really terse covering letter, which is, don't even think about sending it back when it's finished. We're not interested. If this is the quality of the work that you're presenting to us, forget it. Find someone else to publish it. So please make sure you think it's finished. Now, it's not unusual for the person who reviews it to think it's one draft short of being finished. But that's a different feeling. I think it could be pushed to another level. And that's what the review process is about. It's about somebody looking at it and saying, that's good, it's good, hopefully. However, you could just up this bit, and I'm not quite sure how you get from here to here. So the feedback that you get is to hope, well, it's either to say, I'm sorry, we don't think we can publish this, but if you are getting feedback because people think it's up to being published at some stage, it's to try and improve the quality of it. And that's you know, it's useful. I've never yet had a journal article that I've submitted for review that hasn't been immensely improved by the feedback. That's not to say I don't get the feedback back and do they don't know what they're talking about, they don't know who they're dealing with, they don't know what a stupid thing to have said. And then you look at it again, you think, the reason I'm feeling so irritated is because they are absolutely right. Just, I'm sure, on occasions when you get feedback from us and you get irritated, believe me, the feedback we give is much more gentle than the feedback academics give to other academics. This is unsophisticated and naive. Okay. So be prepared for detailed and critical feedback. Be prepared for it before you send it off. Expect to have to make major changes. It doesn't mean that you necessarily will, but if you start with that expectation, it is less of a shock. When somebody comes back and says, right, section 2 should be before section 1, we don't understand why this is here, where are you going with that? Don't be surprised with that level of comment. I think if you are writing for a journal and you don't have a piece of work to begin with that you are reworking, so you're starting from scratch, you're writing from scratch, and it's a law review you're writing for, expect to spend months on it, really. I expect to spend a year on a journal article. Now, obviously, it's not the only thing I'm doing, but I would not expect to be able to get a journal article from start to finish, from zero to finished, in less than a year. Now, if you've already got a piece of work that you've got something, you've got a draft, you're a good way down the line with that process. Whether it's a chapter from a PhD, a dissertation, a piece of coursework, something else. This is not a quick thing. And it's a case of, do you want to give that time over for this? And if you're rejected outright and they say this is a no, look around for somewhere else to publish it, because it may be a no because it's good quality but it doesn't fit their audience. You can try and minimise those things by checking the audience for the journal, having a look to see the sorts of things they publish before you submit. Now, the Westminster Law Review are very clear about their audience. It's on the website, you can look at that, so that's much easier. But also look at what they're looking for. You know, I know in the past they have had work where somebody's basically said, I did well in this essay, I'm just going to send it off. You know, here's a piece of undergraduate coursework with the title of the undergraduate coursework that was set to everybody in the second year. Here you go. And you think it's not long enough, it's not weighty enough. It's not that it couldn't get somewhere, it's not that it couldn't be a good article, but this is not an article. This is a piece of coursework which, whilst excellent, isn't yet an article, so it's going to need some work. And if you think that you'd like to publish that as it is, look around for something that's looking for shorter contributions. Look around for something that's, you know, that's more in the market for something that's 2,500 words. Don't give up. Most academics would say that they've got an article floating around. They're often known as back burner articles or back of filing cabinet articles in the old days. Mind you, some of us still have them in filing cabinets, where you've done something and you thought it was really very good and you got horrible feedback on it, and in the end you got thoroughly dispirited and it went in the back of a filing cabinet with you thinking in your head, I spent ages on this, one day I'm going to rework it. My advice would be minimise your number of back burner or back of filing cabinet articles. Just rework it for something else. If necessary, cut it up. Short piece here. These days with blogs, good quality blogs, just get it out there rather than having it sitting in a drawer or in a filing cabinet or blinking on your desktop for years. So most things can be resurrected and reworked, but you're better off trying to do it whilst you can still remember what it's about rather than coming back to it in 10 years' time, is my advice. Okay, I said I thought I'd talk for about an hour and 10 minutes, and I think that's about what I've done. It's not bad, is it? I'm happy for any questions or comments. None. I don't know whether that's good or bad. Yes, do.
How long did it take you to write the public textbook?
Oh, the public law. Well, the public law textbook is a slightly different beast because it's about 350,000 words. Not all mine and Harriet's. I wrote it with Harriet because it's a text, cases and materials book. So in terms of our commentary is about 60%, and then the cases and materials is about 40%. So whatever 60% of about 350,000 words is, was ours. About 200,000 words, I suppose. Just a couple of PhDs, just over. That's a little bit different because, well, firstly, we're writing obviously for a slightly different audience. So textbooks are generally, unless they're practitioner texts, written for students and for those who are teaching, maybe new to teaching, who want something to help them structure a programme, or those who are experienced who need a set text. And the difference is, I suppose, we're trying to work out what I suppose we're also trying to work out what somebody needs to know. But what we're trying to do is explain it in the most effective way for the audience, as opposed to trying to teach something entirely new. So if I was wanting to talk about my new theories on public law, I would be looking to write an article or a monograph, an academic book for other academics, which would make those people who teach and write in public law maybe think a bit differently about public law. It took about 2.5 years on and off to get the public law first edition done. But then I'm rarely just working on one thing, so yeah, it's about that. And also, depending on the publisher, some publishers will ask that many of your chapters go out to review. So we had reviewed by other academics. We still are not sure. I think I might know who they are, or one of them is, but we still don't know who reviewed the articles. They go out to check them, obviously, for quality and accuracy. So that takes a long time. Journal articles shouldn't take that long, and it's considerably shorter. But I wouldn't say you can just say 200,000 words this long, 8,000 words this long. And it also depends how much you've already written in the area. If you're writing a journal article on something you've already written on, it's usually a lot faster. But if you're starting from scratch, or you're trying to take a very different angle from the one that you've done previously in an area, it can take a considerable period of time. My pleasure. Yeah? It's a difficult one. So introductions, how to make sure that you've got the right content without having everything in there, but having enough in there so that you can make it interesting and also act as a signpost. It is quite hard, and I think the introduction is actually the hardest bit to get right. I think the easy bit of the introduction is the signpost phase. So once you're clear on what your subsections are, that's very easy, because you're saying we're going to deal with this and this and this and this and this. That's easy. It's not easy to do at the beginning when you're not clear on your goals, or if you're somebody who writes and thinks I'll work out what my subsections are later, I just want to write. Now, I don't write like that, or I don't write like that anymore. It's not that I didn't, but I don't write like that anymore because it doesn't work for me. So before I write an article, before I really properly start writing up an article, I know my main question, I know my sub-questions, because I think they logically flow from my main question. I might need to play around with them a bit. I've already got that set out in the document. I can then list for my introduction, I'm going to deal with this and this and this and this. And I think the thing I tend to focus on with introductions, actually regardless of what I'm writing, whether it's an article or a book chapter, is simply to set out the thing that interests me or intrigues me or concerns me about the area such that I'm actually researching it. So what is it? It's a bit like the grit in the oyster. There's a reason. And then what I do tend to do is I tend to provide the real background. It's you probably know this already, but just in case you don't. I don't mean the background necessarily in historical terms. It's if somebody didn't know about this area, they're an educated academic lawyer, if I'm writing for that, for that audience. But if they didn't really know my area, what would be the absolutely essential stuff they would need to know before they could actually understand what comes next? So it's not background as in, I'm going to tell you about the legal system, or I'm going to tell you about the development of the law in this area, unless that's really important to everything I'm going to say later. It's if you didn't know this, would it be a problem? And if the answer is actually it would be a problem. If they don't know this, they're not going to be able to understand what follows. It needs to be in the introduction. But I try to avoid a lot of the stuff about history. People relatively new to writing like to put, actually, and some people who aren't so new, like to put a lot of history in introductions. And I think it's useful to help you, the writer, understand the development. But once you know what you know, chances are nobody else needs to go through that. That was what got you to the level you needed to get to. But would a well-educated academic, lawyer or student know this? Because if so, you don't need to tell them that in the introduction. You don't need to go through, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened.
It's the same dissertation, like you don't waste
Yep.
time on setting up like how it works, you just go straight
No.
to the problem.
So what I would do is I'd say with a dissertation, it's the same with the introduction to a PhD. Whether it's called the introduction or chapter 1, it's exactly the same. It's the context of the study. So if you think of your question as a study, and if you think of your article or your dissertation or your PhD thesis as the culmination of your study, this is what I've worked out. And of course, you've got to write it to work out what you've worked out and then rewrite it. If you think of it as that, then what's the context within which your study operates? And the context is the narrow context that the reader would have to understand before they could understand what you're writing about. But that context is a narrow context. It's not this is the world view. So in public law, if you're writing an essay on parliamentary supremacy, it's a case of what would somebody need to know to be able to understand what I'm talking about later. But you're working from the point of view of somebody who is already well educated, even if they don't know the specifics of your area. So what you're not doing is saying Parliament is a legislature. A legislature is a law-making body. A law-making body makes law. Law is good. It is vital for a legal system. Judges interpret law. Judges are not lawmakers, except they might be, or maybe they're not. You know, all of that stuff, which you might need to go through in your own writing process to work out so that you're clear. because you're moving towards being well educated in the area. Somebody who is already well educated looking at it is probably going, yep, okay. You're right, of course, but do we start back at creation or the Big Bang or whatever you think it is? Do we start here? There was matter. You could always go back somewhere else. So it's a case of what's the narrow context? That's why I'm saying know your audience. If your audience is a group of people who know nothing about law, you might need to start way back. But if you're writing for a law review, everybody who's reading it, or everyone who is the target audience who is reading it, is coming to it with some legal understanding and some academic legal understanding. Now, they may not know the specifics of your area. That may be the background, the context, but you wouldn't need to take them by the hand and lead them all the way through the English legal system first, I'd suggest. So it is a difficult balance. And if you need to put it all in there to begin with, that's fine. But then in the end, it's now I know what I know, is there anything in this introduction that somebody else would need to know to be able to understand where I got to in the end? If so, it stays. If not, it goes. Yeah? Yes?
I have two questions.
Two very good questions. First one, direct quotes versus paraphrasing. I'll look at. Second one, can you use references, footnotes, I suppose, or in-text references in your conclusions? Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Right. There are different views, actually, on quotations versus paraphrasing. I know where mine are. I know what mine are. I also know what other people's are. I don't always agree with them, but nonetheless. Right. Quotations are evidence. Paraphrasing is evidence. That's all they are. It's evidence. It is not a replacement for your argument. So heavy use of quotes and heavy use of paraphrased material is squeezing out your analysis. So that's me saying, here's the knife. And a quote is, look at the knife. Now, there are circumstances where looking at the knife may be fundamentally important. You may need the jury to see that knife. But if you do need them to see the knife, you're not going to just stick the knife in front of them. You're going to explain why seeing the specifics of that knife is important to that case. It's exactly the same with a quote. The only reason to use a quote is because the exact wording of that quote is so important to your argument, and you will tell me why it is, that I have to see those words. Otherwise, it's lazy writing. It's about, I don't want to have to try and work out what this means in my own words. Stick a chunk down, close to the word count. Great. It's quite a long quote. Okay, well, we've all done it. I've done it. Or we've done it because we think this has to be more authoritative than what I can write. Dicey has to be able to say it better than me. Dicey probably still does. Well, he doesn't now because he's dead. But Dicey certainly did say things that far better than I can say them. But the point is, that's what he thought. And if people are reading an article I've written, they're reading it because they want to know what I have worked out. So the only reason for me to quote Dicey is if it's absolutely essential for my argument that people see Dicey's words as he wrote them, and I need to explain how those words are intrinsic to my argument. More straightforward with a statute, of course, because often the exact words of the statute are the point. That's why we need to quote the statute, because it's that phrase that's the phrase upon which the entire thing turns. Maybe the same in certain circumstances with a judgment in a case, particularly in a common law system. Okay, so I would say, if possible, paraphrase. Paraphrasing, however, is still not your analysis. It's the next level up from showing the quote, so it's not just, here's the knife, but it's the, I'm now describing the knife. I'm describing the essence of the knife. That may be fundamentally important, but it's still not very useful to the jury. The knife is 8 inches long. It has a very sharp blade. It has a black plastic ridged handle. It's me describing it rather than showing the knife. Great, who cares? Why are you showing me the knife? Why are you describing the knife? There is a reason for that. So you only describe the knife if you can also tell me why you're doing it. So what is it about this description that is essential to justify the argument that you're making? Now, if you can paraphrase the quote, and you can think about the paraphrasing, look back at the sub-question, look back at the argument. What you can do, if you want to go to a really high level of argument development, is first write your sentence with your description of the quote. So what is it about Dice's theory that's important? What do you want to tell me about Dice's theory? That's usually a sentence and a footnote to say where you got it from. The next sentence you probably write, because this is how our brains work, is, and I'm telling you this because, though you won't phrase it quite like that. Now, if you want to do a really high quality sentence, you take that second sentence, you tack it on to the beginning of the first sentence, and then you redraft everything that comes after it. Because you only need to tell me about Dice's theory to the extent that it actually demonstrates how you got to your conclusion. So the difficulty with a quote is you've got the quote, then you've got the explanation as to how it's important, or the explanation as to how it's important, then the quote. But if you paraphrase, you can hopefully get both your explanation of its importance and the thing itself in the same sentence. And if you can do that, you've got the opportunity to have a really high level sentence, really powerful sentence. Takes a bit of doing, and I don't do it all the time, but nonetheless. In terms of, can you put footnotes in text references in your conclusions? Some people would say no, because the whole point is it's supposed to be what you yourself has worked out. So why are you now putting footnotes in? What I would say is there are circumstances when I would put footnotes in my conclusion, but what I'd be doing is I'd be pointing to, if I've come up with a new, something new, anything new, in my conclusions, and for example there's a tangential area, so I write a lot on the legal profession, but if this finding has been also found in an allied profession, say, I don't know, medicine, medical professionals also experience this, I might footnote that. So I might be bolstering the fact that I found this in one old profession, oh look, another old profession has found that too. But I wouldn't tend to be introducing, you don't, if you can help it, introduce new material in your conclusions, because your conclusions should be simply about what you have worked out, not you explaining what someone else has worked out. Would be my thoughts. Not everyone would agree with that. Any other questions? Yes, absolutely.
In order to avoid repetitive sentences, for example, we argue something in introduction and main body and conclusion. We say same thing.
Wouldn't be the same sentence though. I understand what you mean. So, in the introduction, all I'm doing is summarising the issues I'm going to be discussing. So it's not the same sentence. In the main body, I'm crafting paragraphs, which are basically, this is what I've worked out, this is how I know I'm right, this is how it's important. And then the conclusion, in the end, yes, okay, I'm going to put with all the other conclusions, but I'm redrafting. If you keep redrafting, you should never have repeated sentences, because every single sentence and paragraph is going to go through a redrafting process. So you shouldn't have repeats.
Not same sentences, but same idea.
How many new ideas do you think you actually make anyway? Come up with anyway? I understand your nervousness about it, but experience tells me we're only talking about 3 or 5 things anyway, 3 to 4 to 5 things anyway. And it's about being clear on what they are. I'm not saying, obviously, you're not saying them the same way each time. I think we delude ourselves if we think we're making that many really new arguments. That's not to say that we're not introducing other things. It's not to say that we're not looking at, related issues. But nonetheless, in terms of our main high-level findings, I don't think I think you'll be amazed how repetitive most people's writing is, with people believing themselves to do things very differently. I think I don't know about your writing, but I think if you had a look back through it, you'd see that the same things keep coming round and round again anyway. And I think if you are conscious that you need to keep redrafting, you should work some of that through. It also depends on the level of sophistication of your arguments as well, of course. You're not just saying, da-da, he didn't do it. Da-da, he didn't do it. Da-da, he didn't do it. You know, you're taking people through different aspects. He wasn't there. His fingerprints were not on the murder weapon. And then you're going on to the next bit of evidence, you're going on to the next bit. So, you're not, I mean, the overall conclusion is you're still saying he didn't do it, but you're not saying it in that way all the way through. Don't know, it may be something to give a try. If you've got a better way of doing it, then obviously work with that, because, you know, you may have a natural style which you haven't necessarily worked through in this way, but which works very effectively for you, in which case, that's great. This is only a suggestion of how to do it. But it actually, I think what it does is it makes explicit in one's mind the steps that many of us go through to an extent in our head, naturally, but we don't always get all the way around the circle before we move on. And I think that's all this is trying to do. But have a look back through. I mean, I'm amazed how, I'm not amazed how poor some of my writing is. It's quite clear to me how poor some of my writing is. But I do a writing session for University of London PhD students once a year. And I use my work, my writing, as, so that nobody needs to feel embarrassed and I can just, you know, look stupid myself. Where we look at stuff I wrote maybe 15 years ago. Bearing in mind I had a very junior academic post at the time, but I did have an academic post. Really quite poor. I mean, it did what it needed to do. It communicated the ideas, it demonstrated the evidence, it sort of did it, but it was rather, well, it just about got, didn't get all the way around the circle usually, but it got part way and then it disappeared off and it went round. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I wonder why I did that. And the answer is I did that because I didn't know, I didn't know how to click myself onto the next stage. So I kept thinking there was something missing. I just couldn't work out what was missing, because I'd never really analysed my writing that way. And it's not until I had to do a real volume of writing and I was struggling to get through it that I thought, there's got to be a better way of doing it than this. What do I need to do to get myself round? At which point I worked it out. Other people may have other processes that get them to where they need to get to, but for me that was the only way. And I kept thinking, why does nobody teach you how to write a paragraph, you know, in a way that communicates? You know, saying, let's start with a topic sentence doesn't help if you're not sure, if your topic is just, my topic is dicey. It doesn't help anybody. The topic sentence is really about, this is what I've worked out, and I can't get there until I've worked it out. So if you've got a better way of doing it, stick with it, obviously, don't go with this. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
I would like to know if I've got an argument to argue for and against.
Well, that's a good question. Do you have to argue forward and against? You should already have done, for a really good paragraph, you should have done that already to reach your conclusion. And then once you've worked out what you've worked out, that then goes to the beginning of the paragraph. So, for many of us, in order to work out what we know, we will have to, for our first draft, and this is what many of you will be taught in the first year, because it's the only way we can do it. We've got to take you through some different stages at different levels. First year undergraduates, we'd say, make sure you've got a paragraph arguing in one direction and then one arguing in another. And if you can put them together, terrific. But that's sort of where we stop, because that's enough of a challenge for most people. What we mean is you've got to look at evidence in the round. You can't just find things that support your probably unconscious view, because you've not really quite worked out where you're coming from, or you're not conscious of where you're coming from. You've actually got to look at what's out there and then form your view on the basis of what's out there by way of evidence, not this is what I happen to come across in a slightly haphazard search. So what we will probably do is to suggest to you, try and write down the arguments for and the evidence for, and try and write down the arguments against, and any in between. And that may be as far as people can go at that stage. But a really good paragraph has dealt with all of the competing arguments before it's reached its conclusion. All of that's already in there. And then once you've worked out what your answer is, and that goes at the top, you're redrafting all of that evidence for and against into one justification for your final conclusion on that point. And to do that, you are showing the nuances of the evidence. This evidence suggests this to this extent, this suggests this to that extent, and this is how I came to this conclusion. So instead of doing, here's all my evidence for, so it means X, and then about turn, here's all my evidence against, oh look, I now have a contradictory outcome. In a high level piece of writing, you've already integrated all of the for and against and anything else that's relevant into the conclusion, which then goes to the top of your paragraph. And then when you redraft it, you've actually dealt with, it's like distinguishing cases. If you think of it in case terms, common law case terms, you deal with the convenient and the inconvenient precedents in one go. You don't say, I'll deal with a paragraph where I deal with all those cases that help my client, and then I'll go to another paragraph and it's slightly awkward. We've got some that actually contradict it. I've got to mention them, but I'm kicking them under the table. What you would do is you deal with them all in one hit and show why you thought you were right with this and why these cases you think apply and these can be distinguished. It's exactly the same with your evidence base. But we can't usually get you to that point to begin with. We've got to get you beyond, we've got to get you there and then get you to deal with the nuances of the evidence. So you should know at the beginning of your paragraph what your position is, having looked at the evidence for and against. Then redraft. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Webley. I'm very wary of the time, so we're going to move straight on to Pravin, who's going to explain to us what editors want from both his own perspective as an editor and as a previous author for the Westminster Law Review.
Okay, so as Suresh said, I'm in the unique position of being both an editor of the Law Review and a previous contributor. And so what I've handed out to all of you. You should all have a copy of my article that was published, and it was in particular reviewed by Lisa herself. So a lot of it, pretty much all her feedback went into the final issue. I'm not going to really talk about the article so much in detail, but really just refer to it in terms of what the editors really are looking for. Much of it was pretty much covered by Lisa, but a couple of issues I just wanted to highlight. So the issue of the first thing we generally look for is essentially what is the overall argument, or is it clear from the very beginning what you are trying to do? So I mean, Lisa referred to the research question. So we would say, well, is there a sense of what the answer to that question might be? And we'd look in the introduction and in maybe the abstract if you sent one. So I mean, just to refer to my article, perhaps if you see the first page, which would be page 20, the very first page. So the very first paragraph is basically going to the background of what is the household waste policy in the UK, situating the directive, what the obligations on the UK government are. And the second paragraph basically says, this is what I'm going to do. The article itself is theoretical, but it pretty much applies a particular philosopher and what their work can tell us about household waste policy. The other thing we look for, and this was an area where, when I initially submitted the Westminster Law Review, was one which I thought I had accomplished quite well, and then when I got the article back, I realised actually there's a lot of gaps. It's does the article flow logically, and essentially does each sentence does each sentence make sense? Is there a reason why each sentence is there? Does it go from A to B to C without any obvious gap? Often, and one of the things I found when I'm writing is that I know a lot about my subject, but I can kind of sometimes, it's easy to assume that others will know about it as well, and so I might jump from A to G to Z, and so it's really kind of, this is obviously something which, as Lisa referred to, the continual redrafting process. Is something which is really kind of dealt with through the continual redrafting, and once you've written your first draft, you go through the second draft and think, well, does this sentence go to this sentence? Does this sentence go to this sentence? And so on. And the other thing that we also look for, I mean, obviously, of course, the issue of evidence. In terms of the types of evidence which one would expect, there's no real saying that one source is better. There's no real thing to saying there's no one source is better than the other, but obviously for a law review we would expect to see at the very least primary legal sources, so case law, either depending on your subject, where it may be case law, maybe legislation, or maybe government reports. So this article in particular, because it deals with waste policy, it's very much an area which is very policy orientated, so there's a lot of references to government reports and parliamentary reports, less so case law, because it's not really an area where there have been a lot of cases in this area. So of course, again, as Lisa mentioned, you need to know what other people have said on the subject in academic journals, and of course there'll be maybe journalists have also written about it as well. One thing we would question though is if the whole article is based on predominantly journalistic sources. You might think this would be surprising, but we have received articles which have predominantly been based on journalistic sources. Essentially, what source do you use? What evidence do you use? The question is, well, it's really always a question of why am I using this source? Does this help me to show the argument which I want to put forward in this article? And finally, perhaps the most important is compliance to style guidelines and the quality of the English. Obviously, style guidelines. We do have a page on our website where which we basically go through. Well, what are the requirements? How should the article look in terms of presentation wise? Really, the purpose of this is really to make sure that there's consistency between articles. Also, to make sure that the footnotes comply with how one would expect to see it in a law journal. It's pretty obvious when an article doesn't comply with it, because you could kind of tell it from the font size. You can tell from how the footnotes look, and it, as Lisa said, it's quite a time-consuming thing. And often, if your article gets returned back, one of the comments will be, please refer to the style guidelines. And in terms of English language, okay, this is not perhaps a major issue in the sense that if it's, we probably wouldn't expect 100% that you would be able to find everything, because I certainly wouldn't be able to, I may miss things as well in my own work. So if it's just a very, very few, we may just correct it ourselves. However, we would still require your approval to make sure that correction is correct. However, if the article is so, if there's so many language errors that the article is not easy to understand, we will probably return it, because obviously if we don't understand what it says, then we can't really do anything with it. Those really kind of what I wanted to say. Was there any particular questions that you wanted to ask me? But I imagine that Lisa dealt with it in her presentation and her answers.
No questions?
Fantastic.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Right, just to kind of give a slight overview about the actual Westminster Law Review. All of the style guidelines, as Pravin has already mentioned, they're already on our website. You can go there, you can have a look at them, you can download them, I think, as well. You can go directly to the Oscola. We use Oscola, so you can go directly to the website to kind of find out what the requirements are for that particular style. We're accepting submissions until the end of the month, but I suppose it's a bit of a late call to kind of tell you, because if you haven't prepared an article, it's very unlikely you'll prepare one within the next week. But just to kind of give you a bit of an insight on the kind of editorial side, we at the Westminster Law Review operate quite a simple traffic light system where, if you send an article through, if we think it's good enough to go, then we'll give you the green light. If there are slight editing changes, or there are particular aspects that need to be altered or built on or something like that, then it gets a yellow light. We send it back with substantial feedback to kind of help you along the way. And if it's not up to the standard, as for example, if you have just literally sent in a submission from an undergraduate module that has no bearing whatsoever to what an article would look like, then we will give you a red light, unfortunately. But we'll do it in a very nice way, so don't worry. I think that's pretty much all of the details in terms of what we can kind of say in terms of the editorial process and that kind of thing. Is there anything else that I've missed?
Two issues a year?
We do. We have 2 issues.
If you're not ready for this one?
Yeah, that's correct. So our deadline for the April edition is at the end of January. So if you haven't sent something in, then perhaps you've missed that one. But we do have another issue that comes out in October. Sorry, and the deadline for that, I'm looking at my executive director, who it will be in July. In terms of articles, yes, that was touched on slightly. So I did mention there was 10,000 words for articles, but that does include footnotes. So you need to bear that in mind, because sometimes footnotes can take up quite a substantial portion of the word count. But we're now accepting book reviews as well, and we're also accepting comments. So those require slightly less, significantly less word count. But again, everything is on the website. It's westminsterlawreview.org. And if you have any questions, then by all means feel free to grab me or one of the other members of the executive committee. There's Serhat sitting there. He's another of our editors, and Shamima's here. She's our executive director. So ask us any questions if there's anything that you need to clarify. If you don't want to ask any questions in front of everyone, then I totally understand. Right, go ahead. Okay. I
just want to say that when the edited review, when we receive your article, we're not looking to reject your work. We would like to, if possible, publish as much as possible. So if whatever, and most of the articles I believe have tended to fall into the revise and submit category, which means that we think there's some good work here. It's not quite ready, but you know, if you're willing to spend the time, you could probably get this to a really good standard. So really, that's kind of, we want to kind of encourage you to. We don't want to discourage you to. So obviously, it can be quite if you're quite alarming if you think you've sent in a really good piece of work and actually you find, oh, actually it wasn't quite good enough. But so yeah, I just really just wanted to.
I'd say revise and submit is normal for good quality work. It's virtually unheard of for standard academic journals for you to get a thanks ever so much. We'll publish it. It just doesn't happen. So revise and submit it means it's hit a quality threshold. It just needs a bit more.
We recently had one article, in fact, that I think one of our editors said was one of the best articles he's ever read. But that still needed to be reviewed because there were still elements of it that needed reviewing. They were not, I mean, they were more to do with maybe style, I think, as well, and certain small elements. They weren't substantial changes, but it just goes to show that there are always tweaks that need to happen. And you should really not be disheartened. And I know some journals are very, very harsh when they send back their comments, but we're not like that at all. We'll try and give you as much feedback as we possibly can, because we totally understand that, you know, this is something that maybe you haven't done before, or something that you're quite wary of doing, or a little hesitant to do. So we'll try and be as supportive as we possibly can. Okay? Yes, well, yeah, as Pravin mentioned, we're all students. I mean, the academic editors are up. We're all PhD students who review your work. So it's, you know, we understand what it's like to send work through and have someone scribble some notes back, and you're thinking, I've spent months and months doing this, and, you know, you've written 2 sentences basically just deflating me completely. So, yeah. Anything else?